are listening to Hebrew Connections, brought to you by Jeremy Benstein.
Shalom, shalom, la'krovim ve'la'rechokim. Hi, that means hello and peace to those who are close by and those who are far away. This is Jeremy Benstein with Hebrew Connections. This is our third installment of Hebrew Connections on Melitz Radio. And as I mentioned before, I have made a commitment to try to start every episode with a joke. And this is actually a risky business because this is a podcast about Hebrew, and to do a joke that's relevant, it has to involve or incorporate some Hebrew. And I am fully aware that not everybody, not all of my listeners, know Hebrew. That's part of the point of the podcast. And so how do you do that? How do you tell a joke that incorporates Hebrew without ruining the joke by having to explain and translate it? So some of the jokes may, in fact, get lost in translation, but I will translate so you can at least get the intent. So here's the joke. Very simple. Why would you put a Torah, right, the book of law, the book of Jewish law, behind lock and key? That is, why would you try to protect it? And the answer is simply to make it a Sefer Torah. A Sefer Torah. I have to play with the accent there. Okay, if you didn't get that joke, that's because you have to realize that Sefer in English means more safe, but Sefer in Hebrew means a book, and we often call the scroll of the Torah the Sefer Torah. Okay, but if you got that. That actually leads us into the root that I wanted to talk about today. And again, if you're new to the podcast, every installment will combine a presentation or a conversation about a particular root and its manifestations in Hebrew, not in a technical grammatical way, but to make a point about the connections between older Hebrew and new Hebrew, raising some of the complexities and the beauties of Hebrew, especially in how the roots convey meaning and how we get different kinds of words from the roots. And that will also raise issues in the role of Hebrew language in Jewish identity, personal Jewish identity, in Jewish peoplehood, and also in connections between the Jewish people of the State of Israel and the Jewish people in the non-Hebrew speaking diaspora. Okay, so that word that I mentioned, Sefer, which means book, one of those Ulpan Aleph words, things you learn early in school. School, in fact, is Bet Sefer, which means obviously, or maybe not obviously, but the house of the book, or a book house, implying that most learning, or the most important learning, or the central piece of learning is book learning, which may not be so true anymore. And there are schools in Israel that don't call themselves Bet Sefer, but call themselves a Beit Chinuch, a house of education. But be that as it may, it is people generally, of course, use the term Beit Sefer to refer to school. And that root, Samech Pei Resh, the consonants that represent the sounds S, P, and R, are at the root, are in the background there of the word Sefer. And if it doesn't sound like P, if it sounds like F, well, in English, P and F are different, what we call phonemes. In other words, you would have different words that use the sound P and F that mean different things. In Hebrew, P and F are actually just variants of the same sound, and in fact, we represent that in orthography, which is to say Hebrew writing, the Hebrew alphabet, because they are the same letter, just with a difference of a dot. So you have a pei, which has a dot in it, and then a fe, the F sound, which doesn't have the dot in it. So that's why you will get, for instance, the words lisaper sipur, to tell a story, and that sipur might be in a sefer. Okay, and I won't go into all the grammar about when the P changes to PH, but you'll see that a lot also between B and V, bet and vet, and between the one letter that represents a K sound, the kaf, and its softer, what we call in linguistics, a velar variant, where it goes from K to Ch. Okay, that great Hebrew sound. So all three of those have the same kind of variation. So the root of Sefer, Samech Peresh, SPR, gives us two phrases that at first seem unrelated or even opposite, because as I mentioned, the Saper Sipur means to tell a story, but Lispor Misparim, right, clearly using those same letters, actually means to count numbers. A Sipur is a story, and a Mispar is a number. So one seems to represent literature, more in the humanities direction, and the other, it would be more connected to mathematics, the natural sciences. And these define the modern era's two cultures, which are often seen as being almost diametrically opposite, right? The humanities and the exact sciences, qualitative and quantitative. But Hebrew, at least as these words show, Hebrew knows no such dichotomy, treats them, in fact, as related modes of reckoning or valuing and evaluating the world. And in fact, in English, you also have similar things, similar connections or variants, because you can count and you can recount, right? Recounting meaning like recounting a tale, and also the word to tally, like. To tally numbers is related to the word to tell, like to tell a story. And in fact, a bank teller doesn't tell you very much, but they tally. Okay, so there is this possible connection. Now, there's another homonym, like another root that sounds the same, that it sounds like it could be connected, and that root has the same three letters, samach peresh, but it means to cut. Okay, like you might know the word misparayim, which is the word for scissors, or a haircut. Which is tisporet, right, which you would get in a mispara, which is a barbershop. And you would think that there might be really a deep connection here, because what makes more sense than the idea that the barber, the sapar, or feminine saparit, would be the medium for stories and tales, right? In fact, a neighbor of mine who has recently bought my book came up to me and just out of the blue said, I totally understand what you're saying, because I was just at the hairdresser the other day and we were talking about this and that, and she told me this story and I told her that story, and I said, hey, it's really true. And I didn't know what she was talking about until I remembered this word shop that discusses this word and this sense, that maybe the idea of being a separ is connected to sipur. And in fact, you have a different example in Hebrew, a little bit more sophisticated Hebrew. The word for gossip in Hebrew is rechilut. Okay, and that is almost certainly related to the word rochel, not common so much in contemporary Hebrew, but well known and part of biblical Hebrew, which is the word for a traveling salesman, because it was indeed the traveling salesman before the age of digital media, social media, WhatsApp, etc., who was the one who indeed passed on those bits of gossip between households. Okay, so. But that's probably not the reason why a saparit, a barber or a hairdresser is called that, because that actually does come from the word to cut, and the connection between sapar and sipur, barber and story, may have come about because the first writing was actually inscribing, right, with a stick or what's called a stylus, right, and you hear the word style there, and that writing was actually closer to a cutting action than an actual kind of writing action. So literary style, right, like hairstyles, may indeed cut both ways. Okay, so the noun sefer appears in the Bible, but it probably doesn't mean book. It probably means like letter or even document, and it's only later, like modern times, where we get the idea of sefer meaning book, and sifriya, for instance, which is a place of books, i.e. a library. Okay, now what we call a book today, actually the technical term is codex. Okay, this isn't Hebrew, this is probably Latin originally, but used in English to make the distinction between, actually the technological distinction between what used to be scrolls, right, a book that would be written on a single or a connected piece of parchment that you rolled up, versus those separate pages that were bound. Okay, a codex is a bound set of papers with writing usually on both sides. And this type of book actually dates back to the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Okay, we'll be coming back to that CE in a second. And that's when it replaced the previous print technology, which is known in Hebrew, and you may know this word from like Esther, or there are 4 others of these. They called the Megillot. Okay, a Megillah is a scroll, and that comes from the root Gimel Lamed Lamed, liglol, or there's a related word using the same 2-letter core of that, Gimel Lamed. If you double that, you get Gimel Lamed, or Galgal, which is a wheel, and Ligalgel is to roll. So liglol is to scroll, and Ligalgel is to roll. And Interestingly here, and I actually thought about this independently, but I also read it in Amos Oz's and his daughter's, Amos Oz's Zichrono Livracha, right, of blessed memory, and his daughter Fanya Oz Salzberger, a neighbor of mine here in Zichron Yaakov, who wrote a wonderful book called Jews and Words. And they pointed out that the digital technologies that threaten the continued existence of the printed book have actually brought this idea of scroll back in fashion. But now it's a verb, not a noun, and it's performed not with a quill, but with a mouse. And as they wrote, father and daughter team, textuality has come full circle from tablet to tablet and from scroll to scroll. Pretty clever, huh? Anyway, so I mentioned that technological transition happened in the 1st century CE. Now, CE, as you may know, refers to the Common Era, what many Westerners, especially the Christians, call AD, which is short for the Latin Anno Domini, the year of quote-unquote, our Lord, and the BC, of course, stands for before Christ. So those of us who do not date our histories from the life of that man, as they say in the Talmud, that man, Hahu Gavra, we actually simply talk about the counting, okay? And so when you say in English CE and BCE, before the Common Era and before the Common Era, in Hebrew you say La Sfira, which means of the counting, or lifnei hasfira, before the counting, that general counting that we accept in the West. Okay? And so, in thinking about this connection between stories and counting, between the math and the humanities here, perhaps it isn't so strange that stories and counting use the same word in Hebrew, because, if you think about it, the symbols of the Hebrew alphabet, the Aleph Bet, are commonly used as both letters and numbers. Okay, so for instance, we just had the high holidays, which started with Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the new year. And if you follow along in your Hebrew letter names of the year, we went from Taf Shin Ayin Tet. I won't go into all the numerical significance of that. It could be too long. But it's that actually represents 5779, and we are now in the shorter thing of Taf Shin Pei, which represents 5780. Okay, the Pei is represents 80, and so so we use this in general numbers. For instance, if you've ever been to a Tu B'Shvat Seder or done anything for Tu B'Shvat, or there's another holiday called Tu B'Av. The tu in those names is actually a number made up of letters. Tet Vav, Tet is the 9th letter, and Vav is the 6th letter. 9 plus 6 is 15. And so both of those represent holidays that occur on the 15th day of their respective month. If I wanted to go into the weeds, I could explain why do we use the rather roundabout way of using 9 plus 6 instead of a simple 10 plus 5? Well, that has to do with a topic which I'll probably come to in a future podcast, which is the name Hashem, or the names of God, and those two words, the words represented by what would be 10 plus 5, which is Yud Hey Yah, represent the name of God, and so we would try to avoid writing that directly. So we have gematria and all that, and of course there are many other examples of gematria. So in both mathematical and textual form, the idea of sefer is an integral part of Jewish tradition and the history of Hebrew in ancient and modern times. And one of these aspects where sefer, it's interestingly has this sort of double life, I'll call it, maybe I'll use that term in subsequent podcasts, that in sort of the, I mentioned in a previous podcast, the historical religious Hebrew, right, that Hebrew that we get from the Siddur and to a great, the prayer book, and to a great degree from the Tanakh, from the Bible itself, as opposed to contemporary Israeli vernacular, which is a more secular Hebrew, and many words have taken on a meaning that's simply used in day-to-day speech in Israeli society. So for instance, the word sefer, it does mean book, and it can be any book. It can be a cheap dime store novel, it can be pulp fiction, or it can be the Bible itself is also a sefer. In fact, that's Sefer HaSfarim, the book of books. But if you speak English and have a knowledge of religious Hebrew in something which some people call yeshivish, right? You may refer to something as a sefer, or the plural sfarim, not sefarim, but sfarim, and that almost almost exclusively refers to religious books, a book that you would learn in a religious capacity, in the same way that the word shulchan, an interesting Hebrew word because it has no visible root, but the word shulchan, which simply means table and can mean any sort of table in modern contemporary Israeli Hebrew, when you say the shulchan, especially with that Ashkenazi change of accent, that back movement there goes the first syllable, shulchan is simply the is exclusively the raised pedestal, the table on the bima, on the stage, as it were, of a synagogue, whether it's at the front in Ashkenazi synagogue or in the middle in a more Sephardi synagogue, and so you have a difference between a shulchan in regular Israeli or the shulchan, in the same way you would have the difference between a sefer and tzarim and a sefer or sefarim. And I think that brings us to the end of our time today. And I just wanted to mention that we will continue to be exploring, hopefully with a joke, hopefully with a root, and hopefully with other reflections on the differences and connections and amazing phenomena that are part of what we call the Hebrew language, which I want to show as being raising the continual question, continue to explore the question of this language. Is it Mosaic? Does it go back to Moses' time in one continuous unbroken chain of transmission? Or perhaps is it more a Mosaic? That is, it's made up of all kinds of different influences and things that only serve to make it deeper and richer and more interesting. Well, that's all for today. I started with Shalom and I will end with Shalom. Litraot.
You are listening to Hebrew Connections, brought to you by Jeremy Benstein.